Well, thanks very much for the more than kind introduction, and also for inviting me to this exceptional occasion, which I do appreciate. So I think this new institute is partly about questions, and in fact I noticed that the first three talks this morning all start with what, why, and why. But I actually have a question mark at the end, so I'm really asking a question, and so I've been asked to write an article with some such title, so I'm very motivated to listen to what you think about this as well. But I think one of the other things the Institute is about people crossing boundaries, so people who have a background in one area moving into a different area. And so a lot goes into that, because as you move to a different area, there are totally different assumptions, a totally different history. So I thought I'd start with three small items of history to do with computational neuroscience, which helped me to understand things. So when I first started working on the brain, so one Sunday I was reading the newspaper, and there was a report of a very well-known neurobiologist, a Nobel Prize winner, saying that the last thing he wants is for neurobiology to descend to the depths of physics, whereas the theoreticians who tell the experimentalists what to do. And so I was a bit disturbed by this, and I was wondering what was going on. So then some years later I went to a talk by Peter Dayan, who said I should look at the writings of Cajal. So Cajal was maybe certainly one of the main founders of neuroscience. So he was a proponent of the neuron doctrine, that neurons are separate cells like in the rest of the body. And of course his very attractive drawings still fill textbooks and the internet. But also he had very strong ideas about what research was like. And he was clearly an experimentalist. And I was urged to look at this book which he wrote, Advice for a Young Investigator, where he tried to say what was important for research and what young people should stay away from. So there was this extraordinary chapter 5, which is called Diseases of the Will. So these are things you better avoid if you want to be a successful researcher. And it's a rather surprising list. So people he didn't like were contemplators, bibliophiles and polyglots, megalomaniacs, instrument addicts, misfits, and last but not least, theorists. Okay. He really doesn't say very nice things about any of these categories, and I don't want to ruin your day by quoting too much from it. But I find one quotation which is almost acceptable, and I think that shows, I think, gives you some insight into where neuroscience is coming from. So let's emphasize again this obvious conclusion. A scholar's positive contribution is measured by the sum of the original data that he contributes. Hypotheses come and go, but data remain. Theories desert us while data defend us. There are true resources, our real estate, and our best pedigree. In the eternal shifting of things, only they will save us from the ravages of time and from the forgetfulness or injustice of men. To risk everything on the success of one idea is to forget that every 15 or 20 years theories are replaced or revised. So many apparently conclusive theories in physics, chemistry, geology, and biology have collapsed in the last few decades. On the other hand, the well-established facts of anatomy and physiology and of chemistry and geology and the laws and equations of astronomy and physics remain immutable and defy criticism. So I think one learns a lot from that. One almost agrees with that. But the interesting thing, of course, is that he does have these laws and equations of astronomy and physics at the end, which he likes. So I presume he likes theories which are established, but just the struggle of ideas being debated before they're accepted is a bit too painful, and he doesn't want to watch that happening. Okay, so that's chapter 1, and I think this is a good articulation of the experimentalist viewpoint, I think. Chapter 2, about 40 years on, is computation, which came from nowhere. So Turing's paper famously says, we may compare a man in the process of computing a real number to a machine which is only capable of a finite number of conditions. So Turing was identifying computing with something which did human-like phenomena. Now, I think one of the first papers after that which quoted Turing but was outside the computer science logic world was the famous McCullough and Pitts paper on neural nets. And they said they devised some sort of neural net, and that it's easily shown that every net can compute only such numbers as can a Turing machine, that each of the latter numbers can be computed by such a net. This is of interest as affording psychological justification for the Turing definition of computability, which again is an interesting way of going. But so if we're going to award, have an award for the earliest lens on computation, then maybe it should be Turing, but if you disqualify Turing, then maybe the McCullough-Pitts paper is an early paper which really exploits computation to say something about neural computation. So the idea that computation must be what goes on in the brain kind of became so obvious, and by the 1950s, cognitive psychologists said, well, it must be computation. But where has that taken us? So then there came this phase of computational neuroscience, and just the one person I'd like to discuss a bit is David Marr, who's the one who kind of speaks to me most. So he died when he was 35 in 1980, but if you go to any talks on computational neuroscience and what they should be aiming at, the most frequent quotation is from his book on computer vision, published a couple of years later, where he said that this is what you have to do. So basically, there are three levels. There's a computational theory where you discuss what the goal of the computation is. Why is it appropriate? What's the logic of the strategy by which it can be carried out? So the second level is representation and algorithm. How can this computational theory be implemented? Input, output, what's the transformation? And then the third level is implementation in hardware. So this sounds so reasonable, you have to ask, how could this fail? And of course, it sounds so reasonable because it just seems to be an eloquent description of computer science. This is what we teach our students. That's what you should be doing. And in fact, neuroscientists, they don't actually follow this very carefully. They like quoting it. Now, the reason why it's interesting to discuss is that Marr is a very interesting person to discuss. So first, he did follow this program earlier in writing three very detailed papers on the cerebellum, the cortex, and the hippocampus. And so he was a mathematician by background, knew a lot about neurobiology. And the cerebellum paper is probably, the theory is still alive. It's a plausible hypothesis still to have. So he really worked at this. But the ironic fact is that he gave up on this. And already in 1973, he kind of changed fields. And he wrote, I do not expect to write many more papers in theoretical neurophysiology, at least not for a long time. And an interesting question is why. And in a later book review, okay, I should add, but I should be very surprised if my 69 and 71 papers turn out to be very wrong. So the Cortex paper he omitted, but he thought maybe the other ones were on the right track. So it wasn't that he thought that his work was worthless, but he gave up. And then in the book review, he gave kind of the two reasons which people give for why you shouldn't pursue this field at all. So one is that we don't know enough. With problems of biological information processing, there's been almost no experience, and one's intuition is at best untrustworthy. And then the other reason is the even worse one is that maybe there's no theory. So it may even be that biological information processing admits of no general theories except one so unspecific as to have only descriptive and no predictive powers. So maybe if you look at a simple animal, it's got a circuit, there's nothing to say about it besides it is what it is. So the question is, what should we do now? And so in particular, with more knowledge in computer science, how should we update this? Was this wrong? Or why does this not give us a good direction? And so the direction I went in is the very simple one, motivated by the idea that if you, show me a briefcase and say that it's got an orange and 3 unread papers in it, and give me a theory of it, then I'll throw up my hands. I don't know. But if you say I've got a briefcase and there are $1 million in banknotes in there, give me a theory, that would be more interesting. So, how do you get those banknotes in there? What kind of banknotes could they be? Why are you carrying around that money? So once there's some significant constraints, then one can have a theory. So, so the approach which I've been pursuing is certainly accept Marr's statements, which are kind of self-explanatory, I think. But one thing we've learned in computer science is that we need models of computation. So, for example, just saying algorithms and hardware implementation is not enough. We know there are many levels of explanation. We have to decide on a level and explain what's appropriate at that level. So that's what we do in computer science. And the other equally important thing is that we want to solve problems which are hard, which is hard for the brain to do. If it's too easy, then there may be many ways of doing it, and there may be no theory of it. But if we can't even imagine how the brain does it, then we've got a much better chance of guessing how it does it and of exploiting our knowledge of constraints. Okay. So, of course, this emphasis on constraints is also based on the success which computer science has had in analyzing various phenomena. So, some of computer science looks at communication, the costs of communication under various conditions. And a bit more difficult is if you actually want to compute on these n bits of information. And so we study computational complexity. It's a very successful field. And if you want to go higher, then besides computing a function, you can also ask questions about how you can learn the function if no one gives the program for it, but you have to learn it from examples. And one thing which some of us have been involved in more recently is one level up still, which is evolution. So it's a kind of learning where the extra Darwinian constraints. So again, our bodies have compute functions, and how did they get there? So I like this picture. I think it shows us that in computer science we're studying phenomena which are very relevant to biology, and people should know about this, and we should be able to help biologists. And in that, with that idea, I've actually taken some time to write a book, hopefully of general interest, to try to persuade people outside computer science that what we have to say is of some interest. So basically explaining the fact that in computer science we study these things like computation, communication, learning, and evolution. So now what I'm going to talk about today is, I lost one of my slides, but never mind, is the brain, and for that we don't need all of this. So in particular, so I think my slides got reversed somehow. So for the most difficult, okay, so after some effort, I was a bit surprised to find out that in the brain, the main impediments come very, very far down. So it seems to me that the brain is very communication bounded, and you're going to get many constraint problems just from that. But we can't ignore the rest. So for example, for evolution, I think one important thing which I want to keep to is the idea that if you have some theory of Cortex, then even a random jumble of neurons should do something interesting. So it's very hard to evolve. If your theory needs a very special structure for neurons, then you should need it. And as far as inductive learning, which is what I hope to apply to understand the brain, again, one can take a simplistic view that back in the 50s, Frank Rosenblatt had the idea of a perceptron, and the perceptron is a powerful learning method. It's state-of-the-art with suitable mutations. And also we know that things which are, if you want to learn much more, they're impediments. and on the other side, we know that, in fact, neuron-like things can execute it. So it's a very fortuitous thing, this perceptron. And if we keep to very simple learning methods, then already we have solved some problems. Okay, so what does one do? So I'll try to follow this path which I described, Marr with a slight updating. So we need a model of computation, so I'll describe that. And given a model of computation, what computer scientists do is dance around this triple. So we have to specify what task we're trying to compute, and then we need an algorithm, and we need to represent the data. And somehow these three things have to be pursued simultaneously. You can't just study an algorithm if you don't know what it's for and how you represent data. So this is kind of what computer science does, and what I think one can try to apply to neuroscience. So of these, already Marr said that the primary unresolved issue is what functions you want implemented and why. So if you want to say what's the hardest part of neuroscience, it's guessing what the brain is trying to do. So you have to try to guess what function is computing. Once you've done that, then maybe the rest we can, in a workman-like way, figure out. But this one is the hard one. Okay, so as I said, my starting observation is that the brain is communication challenged. So obviously, through evolution, neurons evolved somehow, and our brains got huge, and as with parallel computers, somehow they outgrew their communication abilities. And so obviously each neuron is connected to a very small fraction of the others, and also the influence of each neuron on even the ones it's connected to is often rather small. So if there are many people and you can only influence other people very weakly, if, for example, to decide anything like what you're going to have for lunch, it needs a committee of 20 people to decide, then it's kind of a different regime. And the question is the brain like that? So what I do, so in recognition of this, is to try to formulate a question which is challenging for this model of computation, which is weak in communication abilities. And so I call these random access tasks. So if the brain is hard at communicating, and you want to find a thing which it finds difficult to compute, then do one which really challenges its communication abilities. And the abilities which ask it to randomly communicate seem to be the most severe. So I'll give you a list of tasks which I think the brain ought to be able to compute, and which I'll try to explain how it might compute. There will be two types of operations. So one operation is that you actually allocate some neurons to a new concept, and then there'll be some other operations where you build up knowledge about them. Okay, so it seems that these are two complementary sets of operations. And so to illustrate this a new concept, so suppose you consider the time when you first heard the name Tiger Woods. So I claim that this is a new concept, and you allocate a storage to it somehow. And one way would be is you somehow allocate it from the name. So what I call this operation is hierarchical memorization, where for two stored items, which may be tiger and woods, which you already know, the task is to allocate some new neurons for this new concept, which will be tiger woods, and you will change your weights in your brain to set up a circuit so that in the future, when you hear A and B, tiger woods, you'll be reminded of this new concept. So this is a kind of this kind of operation is like setting up a circuit in your brain. It's a bit different from traditional theoretical neuroscience solutions which tend to follow computers. So the traditional view is that memory is like storing a string and getting a string out. So I'm more trying to construct circuits which do something, because kind of if you just store strings, it's not quite clear what you do with the strings. Okay. And there's various other implied things here. So I do mean that you acquire a new concept, and with this new concept of Tiger Woods, I want to be able to do every other operation later on, which I could do with the ones I previously had. So it's like assigning storage to a new concept, which is an equal citizen with what you had already. Okay, so this is will be my first operation, and so in neuroscience people don't look at this, but in psychology people have studied this kind of thing, and they call it chunking. So chunking is when you make a compound concept from some simpler ones, and this compound concept is as natural to you as the simpler ones. So for example, chess experts can recognize complex configurations, which the novice won't, and for them this is a simple chunk. Okay, so we take this seriously. Okay, so then we'll have some other operations which will be relations among the represented concepts. So once you've got concepts represented, you want to do all kinds of other interesting things. And basic one is what I call association. So if you know who David Beckham is, and you already know what the state of retirement is, and you hear the news that David Beckham has retired, then you don't have to assign new storage. You just have to establish some sort of link. And the semantics of this will be that for two stored items A and B, David Beckham and retired, you want to change your circuits so that in the future, when David Beckham is, you remember of David Beckham, then you will also be said, oh yes, he's retired. Okay. So if you don't know who David Beckham is, you have to do the operation of the previous slide. Okay. So this is one operation which I'd like to do. And there's some others. So some other operations are inductive learning. So besides just an association, I want to learn more complicated things. So the last one, supervised memorization, is like a definition. Someone says that, it gives me some information which I have to remember. Inductive learning is inductive learning, where from many examples you generalize. And so there I'm happy to instantiate some simple known algorithm, like the perceptron algorithm. And the hard part isn't the algorithm. The hard part is that the target variable and the dependent variables are somewhere sitting in your brain. And so normally with inductive learning, the setup is that there's this box, and I want this box to recognize elephants. But in your brain, your elephant will be some neuron somewhere, and the dependent variables will be somewhere else, and you have to set up a circuit which does this thing. Okay. So we want to be able to do all these things. Okay, and the general strategy is that where there are no theories, where there are no viable theories, what do we do? So I just want to back up a bit. So where we're going here is that I will introduce this model of computation, and the intention is that it underestimates the brain. So I don't want people to complain that I'm trying to do too much. And then I'll specify some set of tasks which I think are interesting and unavoidable. Then I show that these tasks can be executed on the model. And finally, I want to show that I really want to test this. I want to give a very heavy load to this system. So the interesting things about these tasks I've given you is that we can remember, we can execute sequences of thousands of them. We can memorize something, we can learn something, then we can memorize something else, we can learn a new concept, and after you've done this for half a lifetime, you haven't disturbed too much what you learned at the beginning. Okay, so we will do some of that. Okay, so there is a model which I don't want to give the details of too much. So the model, the main idea of the model is that it shouldn't be too creative. It has to be something pretty mundane, so no one says it's not realizable. But the main thing is that it's got parameters. I want to cost everything. I want to show that things are realizable even in the presence of strict constraints. And the three numbers I'll need for the resource constraints are the number of neurons, n, how many connections each one has, which is d, and then the strength of the interaction, of the synaptic weights. So if there's a certain threshold, so you need so much activity to cause a neuron to fire and to communicate, the question is how many presynaptic neurons have to be active for that to happen. So if k is 1, then that means that a single neuron can cause a neighbor to fire. But if k is large, like 1,000, then you need 1,000 neurons to cause a neighbor to fire. And this question is very important, and it's kind of unresolved what's really operating in the brain. Okay, so we'll have three parameters. This will be a model of computation, so it needs more. So we will have finite number of states. We have states in the neuron bodies, and we have synaptic strengths, like the McCullough-Pitts model. And then we'll allow local updates, and the updates will be all local and natural and nothing you would complain about. And of course, a critical problem in neural computation is timing. Everything is going on in parallel, so this model of computation has to say something about timing. And there it takes a simple approach. So the algorithms are local. So on each neuron rides a little local algorithm. So it sees, it's inputting signals, and it does something. That's all. It's got a state, and it detects which of its neighbors are firing, and then it does something, okay? So it's got some very loose notion of timing, which is that each neuron can kind of count 1, 2, 3, and when it got to 3, it's pretty sure the other neurons have also counted to about 1, 2, 3. It doesn't require a very sophisticated timing mechanism. But the idea is that if you cast your gaze at a new place, you've got a simultaneous input, and this gives a simultaneous prompt to your neurons to be active. And so your neurons do something and start counting 1, 2, 3, and they know which stage of this process that they're at. So if they get an input at the second time slot from their neighbor, they know it's the second time slot. So it's a minimal notion of timing. You need some notion of timing, and it's got a minimal notion. So one can make up a very traditional kind of model of neural computation, which is pretty innocuous. Okay, so how do we represent information? So already in how I described my tasks, I kind of gave that away. So in computation, you have to be specific. You have to commit yourself. So when you represent Tiger Woods, then I say, yes, you do devote a certain number of neurons to Tiger Woods, and in fact, a number R. Okay, and the question of whether you can experimentally figure out where your Tiger Woods neurons are depends very largely on how big this R is. So if you've only got 10 neurons to represent Tiger Woods, then it's very hard to find them, and no one will have found them. But if you've got millions, then if you try various electrodes, then people will. And in fact, it's found that in some parts of the brain, it's easy enough to detect what real-world correlates the firing of neurons corresponds to, and in other parts of the brain, it isn't. And then once one said that, then there's one more decision to make, which is whether, so do you allow, okay, given that you devote 78 neurons to Tiger Woods, are these 78 neurons devoted entirely to Tiger Woods, or are some of the neurons also shared by other concepts? And here there's the obvious trade-off that if each neuron you want to represent just one concept, then computation is easier. But then if you devoted too many neurons to one concept, you can't represent too many concepts. So there are reasons to look at both disjoint representations and shared representations. Okay. Okay. So what kind of graphs do we look at? So I look at random graphs, and so part of the where this work is going is that the connectivity of your brain will have to have certain good properties to be able to do all these tasks. And there's some interesting history here as well. So we know that there's this well-known notion of expanders in computer science, which is the notion that if you've got a graph, then any set of, say, half the nodes are connected to a fraction more than half of the nodes altogether. So it's like, if you pick any half questions, do any half of the people in the audience know between them significantly more than their own number. And being an expander is a very good property. Random graphs are expanders. And so in fact, historically, expanders apparently first were discovered in the context of someone trying to do theoretical neuroscience. There's a paper little known till recently by Kolmogorov and Barstin, who basically tried to explain why. So in the brain, you can take the view that the connections fill up the volume and the cells are on the periphery. So if you want n nodes, then the connections take up n to the 3/2 space. And so they showed that effectively that any graph which is an expander has this property. Okay, so what I'm interested in will be properties of graphs which are, so certainly expanders are essential, but they will be more demanding. Okay. Okay. So what does one do? So basically, I've told you everything that one needs to know. I've got a model of computation. I've got some tasks, and you just have to work out the consequences. What if you want to? You've just heard the news that David Beckham has retired. So what happens according to this theory? How is this association implemented? Well, I've told you everything. So I said that David Beckham is represented by a set of neurons A. The notion of retirement is represented by a set of neurons C. And that there's some number R, which is some replication factor. So you've got n neurons altogether in your brain. We have a parameter which tells you how dense this random graph is. And we also know the influence of each neuron on another. So in particular, we assume that you need k neurons to fire, you need k presynaptic neurons to fire for a neuron to be woken up. So from these facts, you kind of know everything. And so if beta is this Bernoulli distribution, so it's the probability that in R coin tosses, if you have probability d over n of success, you get at least k successes. So you want this to be close to 1, which basically means that from the A set, for every node in the retired set, you want there to be at least k connections. Okay. So for A to be able to cause, to remind you of retirement, there's a graph theoretic requirement. Okay, so the graph theoretic property of this is straightforward, and of course the main point one is making here is that so this is the simplest formulation I have, is that here we have no intermediate nodes. All the communication is done directly from the inputs to the outputs, and this works as long as the A is huge and the C is huge. Even if there are few connections from each neuron, you will have enough connections to each retired neuron to wake it up from the A neurons. Okay, so this works if this picture works if you got R is very large. Okay, so there's and then the last thing is that this is just the graph theoretic requirement. You also want that you can change the weights to affect this. So to realize this, you have some weight changes, and you have to show that by prompting A and C in some way, according to some protocol, you can affect the weight changes. So there's a model of computation, and the weight change is happening when you execute these little programs riding on the neurons. Okay. So quickly, the other operation I had is when you create new neurons create a new representation. So this is different from the previous one, but very similar in other cases. So in this case, A and B are already allocated. The question is, where on earth do you store this new concept, Tiger Woods? So this issue of where you store a new concept should be there in every theory of how the cortex works. So my proposed solution is that the answer is the simplest one. So where you store your new concept are just those neurons which are well connected to the neurons you're using to key the representation. Okay, so if you happen to store Tiger Woods on his name, then it'll be the nodes which are somehow well connected to both Tiger and Woods. But you could have stored it on golf and something else, or on his appearance, or anything else. Okay, and again, you get some graph theoretic constraints derived from the Bernoulli distribution, and again, you have to show that when you want to do this act of memorization, then if you trigger the set of neurons in the right according to some protocol, then you change some weights to do that. Okay. So things aren't quite so easy because I've given you the positive requirements, but there are also some negative ones. So when you fire A and B, you want C to fire, but I haven't been very clear so far on the semantics. So for example, what if you only fire 90% of A or 70% of A, or what should happen? So certainly, if only, say, 50% of the Tiger neurons fire, maybe 100% of the Woods neurons fire, should you be reminded of Tiger Woods? Okay, so that's the issue. That's the issue. So there are these negative constraints which ensure that that unintended byproducts don't happen. Okay, so one can prove little theorems that each of these acts separately is doable, but the real issue is what happens if you want to really memorize a long sequence of associations. So in a lifetime, we can do these acts every day, and although we forget, what's amazing is that we don't destroy our previous memories too much. So with Vitaly Feldman, mainly he did some very significant large-scale simulations on a large computer. And basically, the task was that you had a network, and then you gave it a sequence of associations. You had some base concepts, and then you gave a sequence of associations. David Beckham retired, David Beckham did something else, retirement means something else. There was some inductive learning. So inductive learning means that to a target, you want to learn about golf. You give many inputs over at different times, and maybe interspace between other things, and you still want it to work. So we did this, and then you want to find out, at some point this thing will fail, and you want to see, so these things fill up, they don't forget, so at one point they will fail, and you want to know what's the limit. So now we have to admit some point of ignorance, that the model has some parameters, and so the most glaring thing which we don't know enough about is the strength of influence of one neuron on another. So the question is, how strong are synapses, say in human cortex? as they operate. And so again, I said, so K is how many presynaptic neurons you need to cause a postsynaptic neuron to fire. And certainly the average synapse is believed to be very weak, otherwise something terrible would happen. But if you got stronger synapses, then computationally that would be very helpful. And certainly, you know, if you look for them, they can be found, but whether they're dynamic, you need them to be dynamic if you use them for learning. Whether they're dynamic and in what kind of computations they take part isn't known. So this K, this synaptic strength, is a parameter of the model. And so before I tell you the experimental results, so eventually, I found two rather different regimes in which there may be useful computation to be carried out in this kind of framework. And so one had, the first one had weak synapses, many neurons to fire before the postsynaptic neuron fires. And the second one had very strong synapses. A single neuron could act on another neuron. It was almost Boolean. And depending on these two assumptions, many things followed. And you get two regimes. So in the first one, how it works is that you need very many neurons to represent a concept. R is large, it's huge. But then if it's so huge, then you can't reserve, have each neuron represent a different concept because you don't have enough neurons. So then it has to be shared. And in the second regime, which is kind of more Boolean, you can assign a small number like 50 neurons to Tiger Woods, and then you can have them disjoint. And okay, so there are two areas in which it was worth investigating. Okay, so these are the simulations. So in this, first regime, so we tried 10 to the 8 neurons, some significant part of a human brain, 8,000 connections per neuron. These were like long-term connections. This is kind of a reasonable number. And K was 16, which we thought as largest, so you need 16 neurons to cause a postsynaptic neuron to fire, or that's the minimum you needed. Of course, they could be weaker. So here we found that you needed vast number of neurons to represent an item, 360,000. But they could be shared. And in this regime, we found that you could support about 3,000 odd actions. So memorizations, whatever. Now, this regime is the one which is closest to experiments in that, of course, there are some well-known experiments where people try to find in some parts of the brain neurons which respond to a famous person, Jennifer Aniston, Bill Clinton. And the fact that by trying a few neurons, you can find a neuron which seems to correspond to this person you chose in your mind ahead of time, suggests that there are very many of them. And another phenomenon is place cells. So if you have a mouse and you bring it into a room, then it's easy enough in the hippocampus to identify neurons which respond to different parts of the space. And again, just because it's so easy to find neurons which correspond to that corner, there must be many of them. So this regime with relatively weak synapses and many neurons representing an item is an attractive one. But the downside is that this 3,200 is a rather small number. And so certainly we as humans, we have expert knowledge in the hundreds of thousands. So the other experiment was on the other regime, which had very strong synapses, essentially so Boolean strength, and with similar numbers. So now we could, instead of 360,000, we only spent 100 neurons on each concept. And here we could support 250,000 successive actions, without degrading the earliest ones too much. So the first few things which were memorized were still there to be retrieved. Okay. Okay. So Okay, so kind of the summary of what these experiments say is something like this. We've got these two regimes, weak synapses, strong synapses, and the weak synapses have rather small capacitors. But one advantage is that these weak synapses support the algorithms I've described. So they're very simple, there are no intermediate neurons, so almost a random collection of neurons will achieve this. So one can imagine how evolution would have evolved these first kind of things. And to get these very large capacitors, which you can achieve by the strong synapses, you have to do the intermediate nodes. The algorithms get slightly more complicated, so one could imagine that's a later stage of evolution. So quickly these numbers. So an organism in which these numbers have been measured is the locust, and one can explain away a circuit in the locust quite well using this analysis, but I won't do that. What I want to end on is to emphasize one weakness of what I've described as a mechanism. So the main problem with what I've described is that the first operation I described, hierarchical memorization, is unstable. It's unstable as far as the number of neurons allocated. So I can assign neurons to Tiger Woods, but then if I want to assign more neurons to Tiger Woods' uncle, etc., as the net gets deeper, the number of neurons I allocate becomes unstable. And in fact, we didn't do this for the simulations. So that's the one thing in which we didn't simulate it in general. And there are various solutions to this. So the solution which I want to describe in the last few slides is the hypothesis that the hippocampus, which is about it's about 1% of your brain, but it is essential for making new memories. One of its roles is, in fact, to help allocate storage. So the simple method of just having Tiger and Woods and looking at the nodes which are well connected to both has some instabilities, and maybe you need some extra help by a special purpose mechanism. And I suggest that the hippocampus does this. So this seems a very natural suggestion because it's well known that the hippocampus does something, is essential for this kind of activity. So the hippocampus is essential for putting new memories in your mind, like memorizing a new person. Okay. And so it has been identified with chunking. Okay. But once I identify hierarchical memorization with allocating storage, then this becomes very natural. Okay. So the hippocampus is a small part of your brain. So your neocortex is top left corner. Of course, that's the main part. This is not to scale. But it's a kind of a feed-forward thing with these 4 yellow boxes. It's mainly feed-forward. But it's well connected to the rest of your brain in both directions. So it's been a puzzle. What is essential, but what does it do exactly? So what one can show is that it could do this stable memory allocation process. So if you look at a feed-forward network of a small number of layers of threshold elements, you want to analyze how stable it can allocate neurons. And if you have the right parameters, then these are the kind of results you can get. So the idea is that on the left-hand side is the density of neurons which are firing, say, because you want to recognize you have Tiger and Woods are firing, but there are different numbers of neurons and depending on what you do. So you put it through a feed-forward network, and in the end, the fraction of neurons which will fire will be very stable. So you need to choose the parameters very carefully to have this effect. But the idea is that in this neuron allocation process, you need some stabilizing mechanism. Otherwise, the other explanations are kind of less satisfactory. And also, the hippocampus has this very strong association with the task of allocating new memory, in the sense that if you lose your hippocampus, then this is exactly what you cannot do. Okay, so I'll finish on that. So there's your hippocampus, the blue thing, very small part of your brain. Which the hypothesis. So the hypothesis on the hippocampus fits in with with what I've described for a way which Cortex may work. So actually, one issue with Marr was that in the end he tried to connect his theories of hippocampus and Cortex, and I think that's probably when he gave up. So what I've described. You have to make some choices in doing theoretical neuroscience. You need a model of computation, you need a representation, you need a style of algorithms, and you have to choose some tasks. So you have to make some choices. This is the Marr++ formulation. You have to make some choices and have it fit together and see how it fits the brain. So thank you. Yes. But the simulation is tested. Okay, so it depends. The simulation is tested how well the predictive algorithms I had performed on a large scale, on a scale where one couldn't analyze it anymore. You could analyze these things one shot at a time when the graph was random, created and pure. But once you did many operations, they lost their independence. So they verify the viability of these algorithms on a scale to where analysis can go. Yeah. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but what the model says is that you allocate storage for something first, and then there are thousands of other connections you can make between the things you've memorized. So that's what you mean by redundancy.
So you're going to have different paths to get to your information.
Yes. So if initially you allocate storage, so you memorize Tiger Woods from the name, and then if you had some association, well, then you could also bring Tiger Woods to mind through a different line. Yes. So you allow a massive amount of redundancy in that sense. Yes. That's the point. Yeah.
I was curious about the role of the associations that you build in your brain and the associations that you estimate because of the world, and you can have crossing between my analogy. I was actually thinking of the example is a story about the Scottish golfer Sandy Lyle in 1992. The Tiger Woods amateur was asked what he knew Tiger Woods, and he said, "I'm not sure. I've never played the cricket." So he put out Sandy Lyle under 8,000 golf courses, 1,000 golfers. Classified Tiger Woods by default as an 8 golf course. He didn't know that. So there's some notion that you have these machine associations that because the world is properly modeled and you have to use by analogy. There's something in this model that's not going to be
No, I mean, all the model does is you assign storage to a new concept, and then there's a list of other kinds of associations you can make, and I listed 3 I'm interested in. Maybe you want to add some more which are more statistical, correlational. So there's room for adding more kinds of relationships. I don't know whether that answers your question. Okay.
Can you say something mechanism in this model. When I think of retired, the first person that comes to mind is not David Beckham, but obviously if I overlay other search terms, British soccer player, then I get back to him. I was thinking of those connections as quite unidirectional. If I want to have an association where I start with retired and go back to David Beckham, do I also simultaneously need to create an arrow pointing the other direction?
Yes, so what I do is totally unidirectional, and from what I said, if I say David Beckham, you may be reminded that he just retired, or the other way, maybe not. So yeah, so in this system you would deliberately have to do both separately.
Well, in observations, strong classes to be secure, but I think in reality, strong classes are not at all tolerant. Right? So when we have weak classes, we get full spark for a
Well, the way I use them, they're still fault tolerant because you still have, say, like 50 or 100 neurons. And so it's fault tolerance as far as what you lose. So I didn't say too much, but for example, in my semantics, so if I've got R neurons for something, then the semantics in the simulation is something like, if less than 50% are firing, then it's not the right concept. If more than 95, then it is the right concept. And the system is such that the intermediate thing never happens. Okay, so there's room for fault tolerance at the top. No, I do have fault tolerance everywhere, but I see what you're saying, yes.